Hello and welcome back to another lecture. This is number 75 and we are starting on period 8. So this lecture is going to give you some context into everything that happened. This historical period goes from 1945, the end of World War II, all the way through 1980 and the election of Ronald Reagan. So there's going to be one learning objective. It's pretty broad. Explain the context for societal change from 1945 to 1980. And with the first key concept, we're going to see how the world is changing and how the US role in the world is starting to change. So that's the United States responded to an uncertain and unstable post-war world by asserting and working to maintain a position of global leadership with far-reaching domestic and international consequences. So as far as the global leadership role, the United States becomes a founding member of the United Nations, of NATO, that's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. All of these organizations are trying to either maintain peace or maintain security or maintain financial stability in the world. They are also first to intervene on behalf of democratic allies. So in South Korea, when North Korea invaded, they went in and sent troops. In the case of China, we helped by sending supplies and money to Chiang Kai-shek as he was fighting Mao and the communists. Now, as far as the consequences for this, the United States increased their government spending as they were sending more and more supplies out to the rest of the world. That's the Marshall Plan. These were European countries that are receiving US aid that are trying to keep communism from spreading. So the United States recognized that widespread poverty would lead to countries adopting or at least considering socialism and communism, and we didn't want that. This is going to put us directly at odds with one of our World War II allies, the Soviet Union. They are trying to do the same thing that we are, but instead of trying to spread democracy and stability, they're trying to promote communism in these countries to provide for their own security. They see the rest of the world and the rest of Europe as a threat, so they want to create a buffer between themselves and the rest of Europe. This is also going to lead to some involvement in overseas affairs. We've already talked about Korea, but we're also going to see us being involved in sending supplies to the people in Berlin once the Soviets cut off access to West Berlin. An attempted overthrow of the government in Cuba with the Bay of Pigs, and finally with the very unpopular Vietnam War that is going to lead to the end of the presidency of Lyndon Baines Johnson. All right, with the Cold War, the United States policymakers engaged in a Cold War with the authoritarian Soviet Union. We were seeking to limit the growth of the communist military power and ideological influence, also to create a free market global economy, and to build an international security system. So the Soviet Union was aiming to spread communism abroad and to build a buffer for itself in Eastern Europe. You can see from the picture exactly how that was supposed to work for them. They did not want Germany to regain its strength as it had before and potentially invade the Soviet Union again. So they wanted to keep Germany separated as it had been after the post-war agreement. It was split up into different zones, and the Eastern German zone was controlled by the Soviet Union. In the countries of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, the Soviet Union had troops still there at the end of the war, and when the Soviet Union allowed them to have elections, they made sure that there were going to be candidates that were friendly towards the Soviet Union. So that's what builds that wall or that buffer. These become called the Eastern Bloc countries. The United States wants to promote self-determination and capitalism as a deterrence to war. This was something that President Roosevelt and President Truman were trying to get Stalin to agree to at the Yalta and the Potsdam Conference. They wanted self-determination for these countries, and Stalin was not going to really allow that to happen because they wanted to make sure that they could protect themselves or insulate themselves from the rest of Europe. In the 1940s, George Kennan, who was a diplomat for the United States, writes back from Europe in a long telegram. So this is communication all done through telegram, and he is painting the Soviet Union as aggressive and dangerous. And this is going to really influence the US foreign policy for years to come and how they're going to treat the Soviet Union. He's basically saying that the Soviet Union is the aggressor here, and if we don't stand up to them, then they are going to roll over the rest of Eastern Europe. So we need to also posture ourselves in a strong position. And one of the ways in which we did that was by creating the NATO military alliance. This is Western Europe and the United States, essentially saying that if one of our countries is attacked, then all of the others are going to come to their defense. That's what collective security means. And this was started in the 1940s, at the end of the 1940s, and they added countries slowly through the 1940s and 1950s. And the Soviet response to this was the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact includes all of the countries that were in the Eastern Bloc there that you see, and that's their logo. And they agreed to the same thing. So now you have this East versus West scenario. Where the Warsaw Pact countries are going to not only promise that they're going to come to the defense of others, but the Warsaw Pact is also going to use their military strength to put down any insurrections that are trying to overthrow the communist governments in those countries and try to put in more democratic ones, as they did in Czechoslovakia in 1968. You can see the tanks here that are Warsaw Pact forces putting down a democratic revolution that was being attempted. All right, civil liberties in a Cold War. So the Cold War foreign policies led to public debates over the power of the federal government and acceptable means for pursuing international and domestic goals while protecting civil liberties. Just like we had at the end of the First World War, at the end of the Second World War, we have another Red Scare. And this leads to a curtailing of civil liberties. That means that people are not allowed to take on these unpopular positions of communism or socialism. There's laws, actual federal laws, that have been written against joining the Communist Party, because the Communist Party is supposed to, one of its objectives is supposed to be to overthrow the US government and institute a communist government. McCarthy, Senator McCarthy from Wisconsin, is one of the people in the Senate that is leading this charge at finding communists inside of the US government and trying to get them out. And it leads to this very paranoid climate in the United States, that people are looking over the shoulder and thinking that their neighbor might be a communist, or that people on TV might be communist, or that people who are writers and novelists and playwrights are communist. And so this is where Arthur Miller, the playwright, gets involved. He's accused of being a communist by Senator McCarthy. And as his response, he writes the play The Crucible, which is a very thinly veiled metaphor as to what was going on. It compares the current situation in the 1950s of people throwing around allegations of someone being a communist to the Salem witch trials in the 1600s, of people throwing out allegations that certain women were witches based on how they were perceived as a threat by the rest of society. There was some success in the search for communists, and anyone who did not publicly profess that they were anti-communist and that they were pro-American, especially in the entertainment industry, would be blacklisted. That means that they would not be able to find a job. And that they would not be hired unless they came up with a loyalty oath, or they professed a loyalty oath. This was something that was done through executive order. So it went through all parts of government, this paranoia that people around the country were communist. And so even President Truman said, yes, it is okay for your employer to ask of you for a loyalty oath to the United States before they are able to hire you. Now, the actions of Senator McCarthy went far beyond what was acceptable and really reasonable. He loses favor after he's accusing the U.S. military, members of the U.S. military, of being communist. And when these interrogations are broadcast across the country, he comes off as a bully and throwing around really crazy allegations, which he never really had or provided specific evidence that would back up his claims. And so he began to lose favor with the American people. But that didn't mean that there were not actual communist spies in the United States. So the ones that I wrote down here, Klaus Fuchs, he gave nuclear secrets that were in the United States to the Soviet Union. Alger Hiss, seen in the picture up to the right, was working in the State Department and also was convicted of perjury for lying under oath about whether or not he had given secrets or was working for the Soviet Union. And finally, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were executed. And at the time, it seemed like that was a very extreme course of action, being executed for treason. But it turned out that both Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were, in fact, spies for the Soviet Union. All right, we're also going to see some big gains in the civil rights movement. So the new movements for civil rights and liberal efforts to expand the role of governments generated a range of political and cultural responses. Now, if you remember where we left off in the last period, during World War II, we had the double V campaign. So victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home, or victory against segregation, Jim Crow, all of those things. And the civil rights movement continues to pursue its goals through protest and litigation. And one of the said birthplaces of the modern civil rights movement was in the city of Montgomery in Alabama with the Montgomery bus boycott. This started when Rosa Parks refused to leave her seat on the bus, and she knew that she was going to get in trouble for this. She had been an NAACP field worker and wanted to challenge the law in Alabama that public transportation had to be segregated, that black people had to ride in the back and white people could ride in the front. So she is challenging the law, is booked, and is given her punishment for it. And then the entire city of Montgomery organizes against the public transportation system. So they say, you know what, if you're going to discriminate against us and force us to be second-class citizens on your services, then we don't have to use your services. We will just walk. We will create carpools. We'll get to where we need to go without using a discriminatory public transportation system. And eventually it works. It took several months of a boycott, and finally the city gave in and they said, okay, people can ride whatever bus they want at whatever seat that they want. And that was seen as a big success because it was a new way of getting civil rights victories without having to go through the courts and just using nonviolent resistance. Now, as far as litigation, that was also very successful for the civil rights movement. So the first real big case to bring down segregation in the United States is Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, in which Linda Brown, a grade school black girl, is suing to go to the white school in Topeka. And the Supreme Court says that Plessy versus Ferguson, decided in 1896, that said that separate but equal was constitutional, in fact was wrong. That in any segregatory system, the group that is segregated from the main group is automatically given a lower status, and that is detrimental to the people who is viewed as the lesser group. And so therefore it is not equal. It violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And so therefore segregation in schools should not happen. Now, it's going to take a long time before schools actually begin to desegregate. A follow-up case to the Brown case called Brown 2 said that desegregation in school should happen at all deliberate speed. Now, that's not very specific, and school districts dragged their feet for 15 years. And by 1969, in the court case Alexander versus Holmes County Board of Education, the Supreme Court looks at the numbers and sees that less than 20% of the school districts around the country had desegregated, and so they call for an immediate desegregation of school districts across the country. And just like that, there was a big change. So you see that there is a growth in the power of the federal government in dictating what must happen in people's everyday lives in order to uphold equality and to uphold civil rights. Now, there's a slew of civil rights cases that are going to be decided during this historical period, and that has a lot to do with the Supreme Court's Chief Justice at the time, Earl Warren. So we'll see Shelley versus Kramer, which limits the enforcement of protective covenants on houses. So this basically says that you can sell your house to anyone you want, whether they are white or black. In Baker versus Carr, the Supreme Court decides that in drawing of representative districts, race cannot be a determining factor for determining where the voting district lies. In the Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the U.S., the Supreme Court decides that hotels and any place that serves in interstate commerce cannot discriminate against who is able to stay inside of their hotel. They cannot discriminate. And in Loving versus Virginia in 1967, the Loving couple seen on the bottom right, they challenged the law of the state of Virginia that blacks and whites cannot intermarry, and they win. It's a successful Supreme Court case for them, and it strikes down the miscegenation laws of about 15 states in 1967. So this is a period of judicial activism, and it's on behalf of civil rights and civil liberties and trying to uphold equality here. So seeking to fulfill Reconstruction era promises, civil rights activists and political leaders achieved some legal and political successes in ending segregation, although progress toward racial equality was slow. So here's where we talk about the other branches of government and what they did. So in 1964, we passed the Civil Rights Act. In 1965, we passed the Voting Rights Act. The picture of LBJ on the top right with Martin Luther King Jr. behind him, that's him signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which basically says that discrimination in the United States is illegal, and it gave states and the federal government the power to enforce that law. Same with Voting Rights Act. It says that discrimination based on race, religion, sex, and whatever other determining factor is illegal in the United States. And again, it gives the federal government the power to go after the states or counties or representative districts that are trying to disenfranchise minorities from being able to vote. There's also a slow progress in civil rights. This doesn't always happen overnight, and just because laws are passed doesn't mean that they're automatically being enforced. The example here is that it took 15 years before Brown was fully implemented and desegregation happened. At the same time, by 1974, the Supreme Court has gained a conservative majority, and they're starting to limit the tools that school districts and states have in desegregating their school districts in Milliken versus Bradley in 1974. Richard Nixon is able to appoint 4 Supreme Court justices, and Nixon is a Republican, so he's appointing conservative justices who do not agree with the growing power of the federal government in trying to achieve racial equality or civil rights or upholding civil liberties. So there's going to be a much more conservative court from the 1970s onward. All right, so we have new civil rights movements. Responding to social conditions in the African American civil rights movement, a variety of movements emerged that focused on issues of identity, social justice, and the environment. So other groups that were minorities or historically discriminated against see the successes and the strategies that the civil rights movement was using, and they start to apply it to their own groups. So we have the gay rights movement that starts in 1969 after the Stonewall riot. So the police in New York City was raiding gay bars and clubs, and they were discriminating against people congregating in those areas simply because they were gay. And the Stonewall riots was a violent backlash against the police actions, and it erupted into a movement that was promoting equality for gay and lesbian people in the United States. We have the women's movement in the 1960s. Betty Friedan, seen in the top right, writes The Feminine Mystique, which is questioning the domestic role of women in the United States, really saying that they should be able to go to university, get secondary schooling, that they should be able to go and have professional careers, and that they should not be relegated to a domestic role. We have the American Indian Movement. This was a response to the Indian Relocation Act in 1959. This was trying to end the special status that Indian tribes had in the United States and the sovereignty that they held over their territory. And so American Indians banded together and they wanted to stop these laws that were trying to take away their sovereignty. And as one of their protests, they went over to Alcatraz Island off the coast of San Francisco, where the prison is, and they took it over. So they occupied it as a way to protest and to show that that American Indians through U.S. history have been mistreated by the federal government. We also have the United Farm Workers with the leader Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. And this was mainly a labor union for agricultural workers, but they also expanded into discrimination issues because the majority of agricultural workers were Hispanic or Mexican or Central American, and they had experienced discrimination. So these two issues of their labor issues and the discrimination issues went hand in hand, and for that reason, they dealt with both. All right, so liberalism influenced post-war politics and court decisions, but it came under increasing attack from the left as well as from a resurgent conservative movement. So the Supreme Court ruled on the side of civil liberties through the Warren and Burger courts. So Earl Warren, seen in the top left, former governor of California, was swaying the court to rule on the side of people's civil liberties, even if it was the unpopular thing to do. So in Miranda versus Arizona in 1966, the Supreme Court ruled that someone cannot be forced to give a coerced confession for crimes that they have committed and use that as evidence against them in a court. In Gideon versus Wainwright, they say that someone has to be given representation in court. They have to be provided with an attorney, even if they can't afford one, in order to stand trial. And if they are not given these liberties and tried and found guilty, then that conviction will not stand. In Mapp versus Ohio, the Supreme Court says that if the police find incriminating evidence in your home and they didn't have a warrant to try and look for that type of evidence, then that evidence is not admissible in court. New York Times versus Sullivan, this is a slander or a libel issue that raises the standard for something to actually be called libel in the United States. And Tinker versus Des Moines School District in 1969 gives students the rights to have symbolic protests against the war as long as it is not disruptive to the school day. We also have Griswold versus Connecticut, which says that there is a penumbra or shadow of a right to privacy within the Bill of Rights, and then that's going to later expand into the 1973 case, Roe versus Wade, which is going to say that the right to get an abortion by a woman is between her and her doctor, and so the federal government does not have a place in that conversation. So you can see how some of these decisions are going to be unpopular with some people on the left and the conservatives on the right. They are going to, there's going to be a slight of a backlash. And it really starts with the election of Nixon in 1968, and his rise to power in 68 is going to allow him to put a lot of conservative judges on the bench, like William Rehnquist, who was appointed by Nixon and then will be elevated to Supreme Court Chief Justice by Reagan in the 1980s. Post-war economic and demographic changes had far-reaching consequences for American society, politics, and culture. After World War II, the United States entered an economic boom. We had a growth of the suburbs, which led to a boom in construction. We had Levittown, so these were planned communities that really boosted that construction industry and helped America's economy continue to grow, even as you had all of these returning soldiers and veterans that would eventually be looking for jobs as they returned. We have an increase in high school education and college graduates, and the return of these veterans leads to a baby boom. This is a growth in the birth rate after World War II all the way through about 1975 is when it finally starts to decline back to where it was going. And it's this baby boom generation that grows up in the midst of the civil rights movement, grows up in the midst of these liberalism, Supreme Court decisions, is usually active in the issues of civil rights, peace, and equality. Now, there's also a counterculture that runs counter to this suburban ideal lifestyle of the living in a cul-de-sac with a white picket fence, and that is the sex, drugs, and rock and roll culture, really seen prominently in the Woodstock Music Festival, where people are looking to just go out and have fun and listen to music and talk about peace and hug some trees, whatever it is that they did at Woodstock. And continuing on this economic growth, we had rapid economic and social changes in American society. These fostered a sense of optimism in the post-war years. The post-war prosperity continued through the Eisenhower presidency. There was some falters in the economy at the end of the 1950s, but nothing too major, definitely nothing like what happened during the Great Depression. But we developed this idea that government can help achieve new societal feats, that we can use the power and the might of government to fix some of the issues that have plagued America for a long time. So President Truman puts forth his Fair Deal. So that sounds very familiar, similar to his predecessor's New Deal. Again, trying to make life and living conditions better for Americans. President Kennedy is putting forth his New Frontier, which includes investment in the sciences and like the space program. He promises some civil rights legislation as he's running for president in 1960. And after he's assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson kind of takes up a lot of his agenda in his Great Society programs, which he's trying to tackle the issues of poverty and discrimination. And really one of the best pieces of evidence that shows that the power of the government can solve some of mankind's greatest problems is seen in the success of the moon landing, which finally happens in 1969. That's something that President Kennedy had promised early on in his presidency. He made a speech at the Rice University football stadium, seen there in the bottom left, in which he says, "We choose to go to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is odd." And he had promised that we would reach the moon's surface by the end of the decade. Now, by the 1970s, we are going to see some weaknesses in the economy that are going to be due to some outside influences like the OPEC oil embargo of the 1970s and it's going to lead the US into an economic situation that's called stagflation. That means that there is not economic growth. That means so it's stagnant. The economy is not growing. And at the same time, there's also inflation. That means that there is more money in the money supply, and because there's a greater supply of it, its value goes down. The problem with stagflation is that in order to solve economic stagnation and the way to solve inflation is just going to make the other problem worse. So if you try to focus on inflation, it's going to hurt economic growth. If you try to focus on economic growth, it's also going to make inflation worse. So that was the economic situation of the 1970s, very different than that of the 1960s. All right, new demographic and social developments, along with anxieties over the Cold War, changed U.S. culture and led to significant political and moral debates that sharply divided the nation. So one of the biggest debates is about the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, especially after the Pentagon Papers are released that were a summary of all of U.S. activities in the country of Vietnam preceding the official start of the Vietnam War, really turned Americans off to this fight against communism, containment of communism in Southeast Asia. They thought, we've been sending soldiers here for years and they continue to die. And there seems to be no end in sight. That was one of the reasons why Nixon was able to get elected so easily in 1968, because he promised that he would bring the war to a close. At the same time, the dangers and fears over nuclear war were still very present, and with the Cuban Missile Crisis showing how close the Soviet Union and the United States could come to a nuclear apocalypse, it played on the psyche of many Americans. And finally, we're going to end the historical period with the Watergate scandal. This was the attempt by the Nixon administration, the Nixon re-election campaign in 1972 to spy on the Democratic Party. They get caught, and once the people who are the people on the ground who are trying to do the spying get caught and ties to the president become clear, President Nixon is going to see the writing on the wall and resign. He realized that he had involved himself in something that was unethical, probably illegal, and so he wanted to just move on. He did not see a political path for himself out of this. And that's going to lead to Americans losing trust in their government. They're going to become more cynical about who is in power and what their intentions are, coupled with the lies that they had been fed about the Vietnam War. All right, thank you for sticking through this very long lecture. I recognize that I am way over my normal amount of time, but this historical period just has a lot of really dense and important information. So hopefully this recap will allow you to put this all into perspective. So first, the United States becomes a global leader in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. Next, the U.S. objective of the Cold War was to limit the influence of communism around the world. Simultaneously, at home, the civil rights movement made significant gains, and it inspired other historically disadvantaged groups to become active as the civil rights movement had. Then the Supreme Court was active ensuring civil liberties. We had opposition from critics of big government, and the post-war economic growth and the baby boomers impacted American culture. And then finally, the post-war optimism will give way to disillusion over the Vietnam War and Watergate. Thank you for watching this lecture. We're going to delve deeper into all of these issues as we get through period 8. So please come back as we start going into the Cold War and the Red Scare in the next couple of lectures. Thank you, and I'll see you then.